Burkina Faso does not have a tomato problem because its farmers cannot grow tomatoes. It has a value problem. Think about that for a moment. For years, farmers in this West African nation have harvested hundreds of thousands of tons of tomatoes. In 2021 alone, production reached roughly 291,000 tons. Tomatoes grown on Burkinabe soil have also crossed the borders into neighboring markets. Yet, Burkina Faso has continued importing millions of kilograms of processed and preserved tomato products from abroad. So here's the question that matters. If your land grows the tomatoes, your farmers do the work, and your people create the harvest, why should so much of the value be created somewhere else and then sold back to you? That question takes us far beyond agriculture. It takes us directly into the debate over economic sovereignty. Under the leadership of Ibrahim Traore, Burkina Faso is attempting something that could change the relationship between its farms and its economy. The objective is no longer simply to grow more food. It is to process more of what the country already grows, create products at home, generate jobs around those products, and keep a greater share of their value inside Burkina Faso. And tomatoes have become one of the clearest examples. In Bobo-Dioulasso, a new processing plant has begun turning locally grown tomatoes into finished products. Yako has added another processing facility. Tenkodogo represents another step in the effort to expand this industrial network. But this story deserves more than celebration. Building a factory is one thing. Keeping it supplied with tomatoes, making its products competitive, creating reliable jobs, and convincing consumers to choose locally processed goods is much harder. That is what we are going to examine. We will follow the tomato from the field to the factory and from the factory to the marketplace to discover whether Traore is building more than processing plants. Is Burkina Faso beginning to build a new economic model? If you value stories about Africa that examine both the achievements and the difficult questions behind them, follow this channel. Because the real story begins where the harvest ends. The scale of this contradiction becomes clearer when we look at the numbers. Burkina Faso was already producing substantial quantities of tomatoes long before the newest processing plants opened. Production stood at roughly 280,000 tons in 2018. By 2021, it had climbed to about 291,567 tons, and in 2022, it reached approximately 313,578 tons. These are not insignificant harvests. Burkinabe tomatoes also move beyond the country's borders. Farmers and traders have supplied neighboring markets including Ghana, Ivory Coast, Togo, and Niger. This demonstrates something important. Burkina Faso already possesses a productive agricultural base and participates in a regional tomato market. But another number reveals the weakness hidden inside that success. In 2023, Burkina Faso imported approximately 16.2 million kilograms of a category of processed and preserved tomato products worth about $3.82 million. This trade category includes more than tomato paste alone, so we should not pretend that every kilogram represented imported paste. But the larger economic contradiction remains. Burkina Faso was exporting fresh tomatoes while spending valuable money importing processed tomato products. Why does that matter? Because the farmer receives value for growing and selling a fresh tomato. But additional value can be created after that tomato leaves the farm. Someone processes it. Someone operates the machinery. Someone packages the finished product. Someone transports it. Someone builds the brand. Someone distributes it to stores. And someone earns money at every stage. When much of that work happens outside the country, much of that additional economic activity happens outside the country as well. This is why producing more tomatoes cannot be the entire strategy. A country may harvest enormous quantities of agricultural products and still capture only a limited share of their final value. For Burkina Faso, the bigger question is therefore not simply how many tons can be harvested next season. The question is how much of the journey after the harvest can take place inside the country. And before a tomato can become a nationally produced finished product, Burkina Faso must solve one of agriculture's oldest problems. A ripe tomato does not wait patiently for the market. A ripe tomato has a clock attached to it. Once harvested, the farmer has only a limited amount of time to find a buyer before quality begins to decline. Unlike grain that can be stored for longer periods under the right conditions, tomatoes are highly perishable. That simple biological fact can become an economic disadvantage. Imagine a farmer arriving at harvest season with baskets of ripe tomatoes. If there are several buyers competing for that harvest, the farmer has options. But when storage is limited, transportation is difficult, and buyers know the tomatoes must be sold quickly, the balance of power changes. The farmer may have produced a successful crop and still be forced to accept an unattractive price. And whatever cannot be sold in time risks becoming waste. This is why a processing factory matters far beyond the walls of the building. A functioning plant creates another possible destination for the harvest. Tomatoes can move from farms to collection points, then through transportation networks into processing lines where a highly perishable crop can become a product with a much longer commercial life. But there is an important warning here. A factory does not automatically solve the farmer's problems. The processing company must offer prices that make economic sense to growers. Farmers must produce varieties suitable for industrial processing. Roads and transportation must move tomatoes quickly enough to preserve quality. Collection centers must coordinate deliveries. And production schedules must provide the factory with enough raw material when its machines need to operate. The relationship works in both directions. Farmers need reliable buyers. Factories need reliable farmers. If either side fails, the entire chain becomes weaker. This is why agricultural cooperatives, irrigation, better seeds, transportation, storage, and purchasing agreements can be just as important as the processing machinery itself. Burkina Faso's challenge is therefore not merely to put factories beside tomato fields. It is to connect the two into one functioning economic system. And this brings us to Bobo-Dioulasso, where that idea moved from speeches and agricultural policy into concrete steel, machinery, and investment. There, Burkina Faso began testing whether a tomato that once had to be sold quickly could instead become the raw material for an industry. Bobo-Dioulasso became one of the clearest tests of this new approach. On the 30th of November 2024, Burkina Faso inaugurated the Burkinabe Tomato Company processing plant, known as SOPTO. The project represented an investment of approximately 7.5 billion CFA francs, roughly $13 million depending on the exchange rate. Its design processing capacity is about 100 tons of fresh tomatoes per day, with reported production capacity reaching approximately 800 kilograms of finished products per hour. But the machinery is only half of the story. What makes Bobo-Dioulasso especially important is how the project was financed. According to official Burkinabe information, approximately 80% of the company's own capital came through the Popular Shareholding Initiative, while the state contributed the remaining 20%. That distinction matters. This was not a factory financed entirely by individual citizens, as some reports have suggested. Instead, it represents a partnership in which citizens were invited to invest alongside the state in productive national assets. The idea is simple enough for anyone to understand. Instead of asking citizens only to support national development through speeches and patriotic slogans, the popular shareholding model asks them to put capital into enterprises designed to produce goods, create employment, and generate economic activity. In that sense, economic sovereignty begins with another important question. Who finances the country's productive capacity? If Burkina Faso can mobilize more domestic capital to build factories, it potentially reduces its dependence on having every development project financed from abroad. That does not mean foreign investment is unnecessary. No serious economy develops in complete isolation. The larger goal is to create more options and greater control over national priorities. And Bobo-Dioulasso gives that idea a physical form. There is a building, there is machinery, there is processing capacity. There are farmers who can potentially supply the raw material, and workers who can earn their living from transforming it. Still, concrete and machinery do not prove that an industrial strategy works. A factory becomes economically meaningful only when products leave the production line and customers are willing to buy them. For Sopto, that next test would arrive under a Burkinabe name, Ardia. A factory matters only when what it produces begins reaching ordinary people. For Sopto, that moment came with Adia, the Burkinabe brand of double concentrated tomato paste. Large-scale production began in early 2025, moving the story beyond construction and into the marketplace. That transition is important. A tomato grown in Burkina Faso could now travel through a Burkinabe processing plant, become a packaged product carrying a Burkinabe brand, and return to the domestic market with more of its value created inside the country. That is the economic chain Traore's strategy is trying to strengthen. But Bobo-Dioulasso was not alone. On the 16th of December 2024, Ibrahim Traore inaugurated another tomato processing facility in Yako, known as Sofato. Its design processing capacity was also reported at about 100 tons of tomatoes per day. There is an important historical detail here. The Yako project did not begin entirely under Traore. It had been initiated years earlier and experienced difficulties before the current transitional authorities helped accelerate its completion. That fact does not weaken the story, it makes the picture more accurate. Traore's role was not to invent tomato processing in Burkina Faso from nothing. His administration helped place these projects inside a much broader political and economic push toward domestic processing, food sovereignty, and greater control over national resources. With Bobo-Dioulasso and Yako together, Burkina Faso had roughly 200 tons of combined designed daily tomato processing capacity. Designed capacity is the important phrase. It does not mean the two factories actually process 200 tons every single day. Real output depends on tomato supplies, operating schedules, maintenance, market demand, and other conditions. Still, something had clearly changed. One factory could be presented as an isolated development project. Two factories beginning to put locally processed products onto the market start to look more like the foundation of an industrial strategy, and Burkina Faso was preparing to go further. Another processing facility was taking shape in Tenkodogo. If Bobo-Dioulasso proved that the model could move from construction to production, and Yako demonstrated that processing capacity could be expanded, Tenkodogo would test whether Burkina Faso could begin building something larger. Not simply another factory, but a network. The next piece of this emerging network is Tenkodogo. Construction of the new tomato processing facility there began in May 2025. By the end of September, reported progress had reached approximately 52%. Early in 2026, the project was reported to be around 70% complete, with equipment arriving as preparations continued for installation and testing. The original timetable did not hold perfectly. Construction experienced delays, and that deserves to be acknowledged. Development is rarely as clean as the ceremonies and political announcements make it appear. But the project continued moving forward, showing that Tenkodogo was intended to become another processing center rather than remain a promise on paper. More revealing than the construction itself was what happened outside the factory. Farmers around Tenkodogo and the surrounding production areas were encouraged to organize themselves into cooperatives so they could prepare to supply tomatoes to the facility. That tells us something fundamental about industrial agriculture. A factory cannot eat concrete. It needs raw material every day it operates. If farmers cannot supply enough tomatoes at the right time, the machines will sit idle. If farmers grow varieties poorly suited for processing, efficiency suffers. If transportation is unreliable, tomatoes can deteriorate before reaching the production line. So the real infrastructure is larger than the factory. It includes farmers, irrigation, seeds, collection points, roads, transportation, purchasing arrangements, technicians, processing equipment, packaging, and finally the marketplace. Seen from this perspective, Bobo-Dioulasso, Yako, and Tenkodogo represent something more interesting than three buildings on a map. They represent an attempt to connect different agricultural regions with domestic processing capacity. And this is where Burkina Faso's tomato strategy begins to resemble a broader economic experiment. Instead of allowing value creation to stop when the farmer sells the fresh crop, the objective is to extend that value chain deeper into the national economy. But networks like this do not appear by themselves. Someone must decide that increasing agricultural production is not enough. Someone must mobilize investment, connect food sovereignty with industrial policy, and convince citizens that processing local resources is a national priority. That brings us directly to Ibrahim Traore and the larger economic philosophy behind these factories. To understand why these factories matter politically, we need to understand Ibrahim Traore's larger vision. His approach is not simply about tomatoes. It is built around a broader idea that Burkina Faso should rely more heavily on its own productive capacity, strengthen food sovereignty, and process more of its raw materials at home. In agriculture, that means working on both sides of the equation. On one side is the field. Traore's government has increased support for agricultural production through tractors, motor pumps, fertilizer, seeds, and other equipment. In 2024 alone, agricultural equipment and inputs valued at more than 78 billion CFA francs, approximately $140 million, were announced for producers. On the other side is the factory. Producing more crops accomplishes only part of the mission if the country lacks the capacity to preserve, process, package, and market them. That is where Traore's role can be understood in four ways. First, he has helped set the direction by connecting food sovereignty with domestic processing. Second, he has helped mobilize capital through the Popular Shareholding Initiative, encouraging Burkinabe citizens to participate financially in productive enterprises. Third, his administration has pushed implementation, including the completion or acceleration of processing projects. And fourth, he has turned local processing into a national symbol. The message is powerful because it is easy to understand. Why should an African country continually export what grows from its soil while importing the finished products created from similar raw materials? But Traore's influence should not be exaggerated. He did not invent tomato farming or tomato processing in Burkina Faso, and some projects, including Yako, existed before his leadership. More importantly, no president can order a factory to become profitable. Political leadership can provide direction, mobilize investment, support farmers, and build infrastructure. It cannot force consumers to buy a product or guarantee that factories will operate efficiently year after year. That is why the real measure of Traore's strategy will not be the number of ribbons cut at inauguration ceremonies. It will be whether Burkina Faso can turn political ambition into an economic system that continues working after the ceremonies are over. Now comes the difficult part. Cutting the ribbon is easy. Keeping the machines running year after year is harder. Burkina Faso's tomato strategy faces several tests. The factories need a steady supply of tomatoes suitable for processing. Farmers need prices that make production worthwhile. The plants need reliable electricity, water, packaging, transportation, spare parts, maintenance, and trained workers. Then the finished products must compete for space in the market. That final challenge cannot be ignored. Even Burkina Faso's authorities have acknowledged that locally processed products face competitive pressure. Patriotism may convince someone to buy a Burkinabe product once. Quality, availability, and price will determine whether that customer buys it again. Other African countries provide warnings. Ghana invested in tomato processing facilities, yet part of the industry struggled with inconsistent raw material supplies, operating costs, low capacity utilization, and competition from imported products. The lesson is simple. Do not confuse building a factory with building an industry. An industry works only when farmers earn enough to continue producing, factories receive sufficient raw material, finished products remain competitive, consumers keep buying, and money flows back through the system. There is another claim that requires the same level of caution. Some supporters of Ibrahim Traore portray these factories as projects that the West fears or actively opposes. There is no credible evidence that France, the United States, or European institutions have opposed Burkina Faso because it is processing tomatoes. There are real tensions with Western governments, but they concern a much broader political struggle involving military rule, democratic transition, human rights, security partnerships, and Burkina Faso's changing foreign relationships. France suspended development assistance as relations deteriorated. European institutions have criticized political and civil rights conditions, but that is not evidence of a Western campaign against tomato factories. It is also inaccurate to suggest that Burkina Faso has completely rejected Western financial institutions. Under Traore, the country has continued working with the International Monetary Fund and has received financing through its programs. That distinction changes the meaning of economic sovereignty. Sovereignty does not require Burkina Faso to isolate itself from the world. It means building enough domestic capacity to have choices. A country that can produce more of its food, process more of its raw materials, mobilize more domestic capital, and work with several international partners has greater bargaining power than one dependent on a single source of money or imported goods. And that may be the most important lesson Burkina Faso can offer the rest of Africa. The lesson for the rest of Africa is not that every country should build a tomato factory. The real lesson is to study where value is being lost. Every African country can begin with 4 simple questions. What do we already produce in large quantities? What are we exporting in raw or minimally processed form? What finished products are we importing back? And which part of that value chain could realistically be developed at home? For Burkina Faso, tomatoes provide one answer. For another country, the opportunity may be cocoa, coffee, cashews, cotton, cassava, mangoes, or another agricultural product. The principle remains the same. Do not simply copy Burkina Faso's product. Study the logic behind the strategy. And that strategy must begin with the farmer, not the factory. Before construction starts, governments and investors need to understand where the raw material will come from, whether farmers can earn a sustainable income, how crops will reach the plant, who will buy the finished products, and whether those products can compete on quality and price. There is also a larger opportunity beyond national borders. West Africa already has significant cross-border trade in tomatoes and other foods. That means a successful processing industry does not necessarily have to depend only on domestic consumers. If Burkina Faso can eventually produce competitive products at sufficient scale, neighboring markets could become part of the opportunity. This is where economic sovereignty should not be confused with economic isolation. Africa does not need 50 countries attempting to manufacture everything independently. It needs stronger national industries connected to stronger regional markets. The most useful question, therefore, is not whether another African country can reproduce the exact factories being built in Burkina Faso. It is whether that country can identify what leaves its soil cheaply, understand where additional value is created, and build the skills, infrastructure, businesses, and markets needed to capture more of that value at home. In the end, this story returns to something very small. A tomato. It can rot before reaching a buyer. It can be sold cheaply as a fresh crop. It can cross a border and leave much of its potential value behind. Or that same tomato can enter a factory. There it can support workers, technicians, transporters, packaging businesses, distributors, retailers, and farmers. It can become a finished product carrying a Burkinabe brand and remain useful long after the fresh tomato would have spoiled. That is the difference between simply producing something and building an economy around what you produce. Ibrahim Traore has not proven that this strategy will succeed forever. Burkina Faso still has to keep its factory supplied, maintain the machinery, compete with imported products, protect the interests of farmers and investors, and convince consumers that locally processed goods deserve their money. But the experiment matters. Across African news, the conversation about the future of the continent often focuses on the African Union, foreign powers, military alliances, and political leaders. Yet, economic sovereignty may ultimately be decided by ordinary questions of production and value. For Burkina Faso and Ibrahim Traore, tomatoes are now part of that test. For Assimi Goïta in Mali and Abdourahmane Chiani in Niger, similar questions about domestic production and sovereignty will shape the future of the Sahel. And for France and other international partners, a changing West Africa will require engagement with countries seeking greater room to choose their own economic direction. The question is no longer whether Africa possesses resources. The question is how much value Africans can build around those resources before they leave African hands. Tell us whether you believe Burkina Faso's approach can last, and if you want us to keep examining the real achievements and real challenges shaping Africa's economic future, follow this channel. Because sovereignty is not declared at a podium. It has to work in the field, inside the factory, and in the marketplace. We sincerely appreciate your time and support. Every video on this channel is carefully researched, thoughtfully written, and meticulously edited by our dedicated team. We don't rely on automated production or shortcuts to create our content. Every story, every visual, and every detail is crafted with genuine care, passion, and a commitment to bringing you meaningful, high-quality videos